Uh, Welcome, everybody, to this afternoon's discussion on the ethics of overseas reporting. I'm Steve Adler, and I run the Ethics in Journalism Initiative here at NYU. And more importantly, perhaps for this discussion, I was editor-in-chief of Reuters between 2011 and 2021, so dealt with a lot of ethical issues in overseas reporting. I was just in London this past week and had a really moving reunion with a Reuters journalist who had been in Gaza for over a year and had been separated from his family, and they were just brought back by Reuters to London. And so we had quite a celebration. It was really extremely moving, and I guess it reminded me of how important it is that international organizations really have the back of reporters, regardless of whether they're classified as contractors or reporters. And it's incredibly important, and Reuters really had his back, and it was really a very moving experience. Today's event is presented by two organizations. It's co-presented by the Overseas Press Club of America, which is the oldest and largest association of journalists engaged in international news, and NYU's Ethics in Journalism Initiative, which offers mentoring, workshops, training, and public events like this one, and hosts the new Collier Awards for Ethics in Journalism. Our awards ceremony is April 10th at the Paley Center. It's free of charge, so I hope people can come. To learn more about the Ethics in Journalism Initiative, please go to our website, ethicsinjournalism.org, or contact our managing editor, Ryan Hosell, who is here somewhere. There she is. And Ryan has all the information, and she also runs the website. I want to give special thanks to Patty Krantz, Executive Director of the OPC, and her colleagues. Patty's here, and Allison Frankel, Senior Advisor to the Ethics in Journalism Initiative, for putting together the event. Thank you so much to you both. And let me introduce the panelists. Could the panelists please come up on the stage? I'll introduce you after you're seated. Great group of journalists who I'm really honored to have agreed to join us here today. Starting right here is Victor Blue, who many of you know. He's a Brooklyn-based photojournalist and filmmaker whose work is most often concerned with the legacy of armed conflict, human rights, and the protection of civilians in combat. And he just told us he's just back from Syria, which must have been quite an experience. His multi-award-winning photographs appear in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Harper's, Time, and many other publications. And I urge you to check out his website, victorblue.com. His portfolio is absolutely awe-inspiring. Next, I'm going to go to Azmat, because that's where she is in my list, and then we'll go to Ida. Azmat, who's been a guest in my class a couple of times and an absolutely brilliant guest. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter with the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine. Her powerful work grapples with the human costs of war. She teaches at Columbia Journalism School, where she's also director of the Simon and June Lee Center for Global Journalism. And she's writing a book for Random House, investigating America's air wars, which she's written about so memorably. Then Ida Alami, in the middle, is a Moroccan reporter, usually based in Rabat, Morocco, and in Paris. And she's now also a visiting professor both at NYU and at Columbia Journalism School. She mainly covers migration, human rights, religion, and race. She's reported from North Africa, the Middle East, Europe, the United States, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Senegal, and has been a regular contributor to the New York Times since 2011. So please welcome our panel. I always sit on the left because I can't really turn to the left. It's an occupational hazard of years of sitting on panels. I don't know. Anyway, so let me start with Ida. Okay. So you have a unique perspective. You've reported as a local reporter working for international organizations, and you've reported for international organizations on the ground. What's the difference in your experience, and how do you see the two, local and international, relating, particularly from an ethics standpoint?
Sure. So I've been on both sides of the relationship, as the local journalist and as the foreign journalist. Just to give you a little bit of background, after I studied here in New York, after I finished Columbia J School, I went back to Morocco, and a few months later, the Arab Spring started, and I had the linguistic skills to work on stories, and I just started working with a lot of foreign correspondents that were coming into Tunisia and Morocco and other places, and one of the things that were most striking to me was how all these journalists would just come in, not know anything about the place, find someone like me, and be like, okay, well, give me sources, give me reporting, and then they get the stories. And there are countless stories where I was never credited, which actually I didn't mind at the time. I just was young and I wanted the experience, and it was fine. But it took me a little bit of time to realize that it can be done better.
Were you paid, and how were you paid?
I was paid per day. I think at the time the rate was $150 a day, and it didn't matter how many hours or how much work. That was a day rate. But I do remember having these moments where I would have all these. At some point, there were so many journalists coming to North Africa, and they would just book a breakfast with me, and then I would be having breakfast with them. They would be taking notes, and then the story would come out, and it was basically my note. Everything I said at breakfast would be the story. So I realized I had some power that way. It's like, oh, how can I tell you the Arab Spring, at the age of 24, and let me tell you all these things. But then I realized that it could be done differently, and there were journalists who were doing it. Of course, not to say that everyone was doing that, but there were a lot of journalists doing that kind of journalism. And that's also why I started teaching, because originally I thought, oh, why? And I started teaching pretty much right away, a year after the Arab Spring, where it was like, oh, there's a way to teach students to partner with local students. So I had American students come into Morocco and pair them up with Moroccan students and have them go out and report together in a way that benefits the story, where the person who knows their country can kind of help them navigate the nuances and produce more textual reporting and find a way to collaborate that's productive and that benefits the story.
So it's become a big issue. It's always been a big issue, but certainly since Afghanistan and Myanmar and other places where international organizations work with local journalists, it becomes very dangerous when you're there. What responsibility do you feel as if the international organization, let's say AP or Reuters or the New York Times, is working with you when you're a local journalist, and then it's dangerous? In your view, do they have a responsibility to your safety, a responsibility to extract you, and just how do you see that relationship in terms of safety?
I think I can only speak about the organizations I worked with that always actually cared about my safety and kind of included me in all of the safety measures they applied to their correspondence. I don't know if that's the rule everywhere or that's how all organizations work. But one of the things that comes to mind is when 4 New York Times reporters were kidnapped in Libya. Their driver was killed right away, and that's something to remember. And I think news organizations are learning more and more to be protective of the entire team.
I mean, I just know from the Reuters experience, they ended up extracting, I think, 87 people from Afghanistan. And it's always a big question of family, extended family. How much work did they have to have done for you in order for you to have responsibility? So just as an ethical issue, it's I think one of the big ones, at least from the standpoint of the international organization. I want to read a passage from an article you wrote, Ida, in CJR recently about Syria coverage. Ida wrote, "The fall of Assad was a fast-moving story which caught news organizations off guard. In the days that followed his departure from the country on December 8th, a rush of foreign journalists parachuted in to uncover the horrors he had wrought, interviewing survivors and families still looking for loved ones. As they competed for scoops, they often seemed out of their depth. In an especially embarrassing instance, CNN's Clarissa Ward documented in real time the quote-unquote release of a supposed prisoner who a fact-checking media platform later revealed was a member of Syrian Air Force intelligence. Going forward, foreign reporters would be well served by following the work of Syrian journalists who know the place best." I thought that was such a good statement. Do you want to comment further on that?
Sure. So one of the first things I did when all these journalists went into Syria was speak to some Syrians I had been interviewing over the years, and very quickly it was like, oh, they're going to these prisons, they're tampering with DNA evidence, they're just taking whatever they can. They're also really overly focusing on the emotion of the moment of the release of prisoners, and they're not thinking, they're not seeing the bigger picture, and they're yeah.
And why do you have problems with focusing on the emotions? You would think that's an important part of the story, but I hear a lot of criticism locally, including in the U.S., when people go into communities in trouble, that there's heightened focus on the emotion rather than the context, the broader experience.
Because I think as journalists, we have responsibility to always frame things within history, within the moment, there's so many things happening at once. In the region, we've seen this happen again and again, where there's a regime change, and yes, it's a very happy moment in the moment it's happening, but we also have to take into consideration a broad scope of opinions and analysis from those who know the place best, and just listen to them and how they view it.
Yeah, right. Thank you so much. Let me turn to Asmat. Actually, I think it would be great if you could tell the group a little bit about yourself, how you got into journalism, how you went from freelance to what you're doing, just to get a little context.
Sure. So I was actually in graduate school when I was writing my thesis. It was like this thick, and I was looking at it, and I was like, oh my God, like 3 people are going to read this. That's such a sad life. I don't want that life. And I started to think about journalism. And this was 2008. I was finishing grad school. And I was really interested in what was happening in Pakistan, which is where my family is originally from. And I, thought to myself, like, okay, I'd like to follow the developments there. There's obviously like a rising drone campaign in the country at the time, carried out by the CIA. There was this lawyers movement. There was all sorts of different developments happening in the country at the time. The Pakistani Taliban was on the rise. And I was fascinated by it. So what I did was I worked in local news in my hometown in Michigan at an NBC affiliate, and cobbled together like the worst reel. It was like because there was, and I think until September of 2008, Michigan was a battleground state. So I took these kinds of like different political coverage of campaign visits, and I made this reel, and I moved to Pakistan, and I just pitched myself backwards to Pakistani news channels saying, look, whoever gets elected in the United States will matter for Pakistan. You want to do coverage. Let me help you produce coverage. So I pitched myself to these news channels, which hired me to produce. So I started producing coverage, and then this Urdu channel that I was working at launched an English channel, and I began reporting for that English channel. And it was just such an incredible and important time. There was so much happening in Pakistan, and what I often tell people is that if you can work in local news in another country, there's so much more to be gained from that early on in particular, rather than only pitching to foreign outlets, because you're going to have like a much wider perspective of stories and issues that you can cover, whereas it's more limited and narrow when you're pitching foreign outlets. And, I got to cover this lawyers movement of civil unrest, the Pakistani military's campaign against the Pakistani Taliban, this IDP surge, and subsequent atrocities committed against civilians by the Pakistani military, and more. And it was a really gratifying experience. Ultimately, it ended, and I had to leave the country because I was getting death threats from people claiming to be Taliban. I don't think they were. It truly was not important enough to be the subject of that kind of campaign. But I wound up back in the States, and eventually at the PBS series Frontline, where I got really into investigative journalism. And really loved deep research, and it was my goal to kind of marry those two things, this reporting on the ground in conflict areas, but also bringing deep investigative research and investigative skills when it comes to U.S. accountability in wars. So like one thing I often think, about, many of my American students when they're thinking about journalism, and they're like, well, what's my role here? Because reporters in these countries can often, they can cover things far better than I ever could, but my role is often related to the country from which I'm coming, the U.S. and its interventions in these places where I'm reporting. And so, that became the basis for stories I did, and, whether that was related to the war in Afghanistan and American claims, or whether it was related to American claims of civilian casualties in the war against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. But it really became about sort of fact-checking those claims on the ground and really like deep Freedom of Information Act, deep reporting with the U.S. military, embeds, and the combination of those things.
Yeah, and data journalism actually fit very strongly in your series, which is interesting. International reporting is not just going on the ground and interviewing people. You want to talk a little bit about the data gathering and how important that was?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that at the outset of any investigation I do, there's like a very systematic approach you have to bring to it. And oftentimes that's like, what is the world of what I'm looking at? So early on, when you're kind of defining that world, it can be, okay, I'm going to look at this group of USAID funded schools, and I'm going to visit a sample of them, and that's the world. And so you start to build out a database of those things. Or when it came to US airstrikes, it could be, okay, I'm going to, through the Freedom of Information Act, request every single assessment the US-led coalition says that it has done to investigate an allegation of civilian casualty, whether credible or non-credible. I'm going to sue to get them. And that now, those 1,300 plus records are the systematic approach I'm bringing. And so you build a database around those press releases and then those records and then the sample you visit on the ground. And so data is always essential to all of this. I spend a lot of time with the institutions that I'm investigating, whether that's USAID, whether that's, the Department of Defense or their, air base in Qatar, where U.S. Central Command is headquartered, and the air campaigns in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan were directed from. But it's the combination of that kind of rigorous data gathering data on the ground as well. So like, in Mosul, for example, like I spent a few months living there in 2021, going to the sites of airstrikes that were the subject of those credibility assessments that I'd sued to get. And that was an incredible amount of data that I was collecting on the ground and sort of like feeding into all of that. So it does come from a lot of sources, but like key to it is, the combination of each of these things and recognizing where I might have something to add.
Yeah. So flipping back to the kind of ethics of working with local journalists, which is kind of our first subject, then we'll talk about working with sources. So you won the Pulitzer Prize in 2022 for coverage of America's air wars and civilian casualties. And if you haven't seen it, just look up the 2022 Pulitzers. It's an absolutely extraordinary series. So talk a little bit about just how you interacted with local reporters on the ground in that particular series. How were they helpful? How did you deploy them? To what extent did they get credit in the series? Just to walk us through that a little bit.
Absolutely. So it ranges over time. Like I started that reporting against, investigating the air war against ISIS in early 2016. And over the years, I was just going back. And ultimately, the series that won the Pulitzer was based on the last few remaining years. But I think it's kind of helpful to walk through the gamut of those years of reporting. So early on, I was a freelancer. I was working with whomever I could in Iraq and Syria. And, I had a co-author and colleague named Anand Gopal, and we were working together. But on the ground, at that time, there was a ton of interest in covering the war against ISIS. Oftentimes, foreign journalists who were embedding with Iraqi forces or other partner forces, and were in a lot of these embattled areas. And a lot of those local journalists would be charging, and they weren't necessarily local to Mosul. They were, in different parts of Iraq, and journalists would hire them, and they would take them into the sort of front line. And it would be something like $900 a day for a lot of that kind of reporting, which I couldn't afford. Like I had gone into debt to do this reporting. I specifically cashed out my retirement at the time. I think I sold my laptop. I did a number of things where, I was a freelancer, I believed in this story, and I thought that I could bring it to fruition. And it was actually a lot harder than I had expected. A lot of people said no to this story early on, but we continued to pursue it. And I would hire whomever I could work with, whoever was available. So there were a lot of translators that worked with NGOs that I would hire, and they would come out with me for a day, and I would pay them $300 or $400 for that day's work. We would be out in areas that were not necessarily the front line, but had been retaken from ISIS, and it was a chance to kind of like sit back and do these more in-depth interviews and sample areas and visit sites, because so often like journalists are moving with the battle lines and covering that very important, day to day, how this battle is going, how the war against ISIS is going. But there was still a lot of really rich work to do in these areas that they had now recovered and populations had moved back into. And so over the years, as I kept returning, I would say that by 2021, I knew, before that I would maybe go into Mosul, for a week and stay, with a family that could keep me safe. But by 2021, when I had those documents and I wanted to go to a really, sizable sample of those airstrikes and those documents, I knew I had to be based there. And there was no one to work with who was based there, who spoke English and, can kind of be out with you. There's maybe one professor there but he had a day job. And so what I did was, and I had gotten a grant, the Carnegie Fellowship, which allowed me to do this. I now had time and money, which I previously lacked. And what I did was I hired students at the University of Mosul's Department of Translation and essentially like train them in journalism. They had translated and they were excellent translators, but they had not worked as journalists. And, I spent the first 2 weeks sort of doing basic kinds of training. And over time, Momin Mohamed, who worked with me in the field, he was knocking on doors with me in I think 30 plus neighborhoods of Mosul. And we spent those few months together doing that reporting. But Momin is not only credited in those stories, I also, in the New York Times Magazine story, had the ability to kind of write about the process of that journalism, in which I described a lot of those people that I'd worked with and their contributions, and to get transparent about what that looked like. And so Momin worked with me, but he's also, described in that situation. And that honestly is really, it's ideal in many ways because you're making that more transparent, but it's also important because it was an investment in Momin too. It was mutually beneficial for both of us. Momin is so talented. He was born and raised in Mosul. He worked in a market before ISIS. He worked in a market that was the most, it was where everyone across northern Iraq and Nineveh province would come to purchase things. They would come. So he understood a very wide perspective of accents. And so he was excellent at translation. I mean, he worked in that market during ISIS's rule as well. And then he wound up going to the University of Mosul, and that's where he learned English. And truly, I could not have found a better partner to work with because of that local context he had, because of his excellent translation skills. But he hadn't worked in journalism, and I could teach him those skills. I taught him a lot of, sensitive interviewing techniques or things that we would be working on, but also, GPS, location saving, geolocation, analyzing satellite imagery, and things that made it possible for him to get other jobs with, not just as a journalist, but also with NGOs that paid better. And he's been able to do a lot of really incredible work since. And so that for me would be ideal, but I have to tell you, it's different in every environment you report in. In Iraq, I found it really comfortable. In places, there are places that I find a little bit more challenging, like Afghanistan. I've always found a little bit more challenging for a number of reasons, but you'll often hear women talk about getting to be a third gender in a lot of these places that they might report in, where they're not considered a man or woman as would be locally. You get to come in as an outsider, and you're not necessarily bound by a lot of the rules that local women are bound to. But I found in Afghanistan, it was the place where my Pakistani heritage was something that would often be brought up, and it was just harder to navigate, some of the things that I would sometimes as a woman. But at the same time, I've met and worked with some of my favorite journalists in the world, one of whom is Bakhtiar Zadran, who worked with me on an investigation called Go Schools. And, he's credited in the story, and he's now in Canada, and is one among many Afghan journalists who were able to leave the country, and who I'm close to. But I really think it depends on the context, and it depends on you and your background and a number of factors.
Yeah, thank you. That was extraordinarily interesting. Thank you. Victor, so you've done, I just love your photography, and you've done it in conflict zones all over the world. Guatemala, Afghanistan, Syria, El Salvador, Honduras, Iraq, other places. How do you interact with local journalists as a photographer and so-called fixers, and kind of what's your overall view of that relationship for you as a photographer?
Well, it's always a bummer for local reporters to work with a photographer. It's always super annoying because, and the kind of situation that Ida kind of described is like the exact opposite when they have to go out with a photographer. And oftentimes it's kind of like a cold splash of water in the face because they're like, I thought we were going to go into the ministry, interview this guy that I have contact with, bam, 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 get some quotes, lunchtime. And I'm like, no, we're going to sit here for 8 hours until anything interesting happens for me to take a photo of, so it's not very fun. So you have to be like quite, not careful, but you have to like really go out of your way to be a good colleague and to be a good employer and to be like easy to work with and flexible, right? That's tough. And I understand that it's demanding to work with a photographer and really boring. The other thing is, the relationship really depends, like Asmat was saying, on context. I started working in Central America and Latin America, and I can't more highly recommend to anyone. The best thing that anyone could possibly do for the reporting period, up and down, left and right, is to learn a language. Like, there is no substitute for it. I've worked in Central America. That was the first place I ever started in journalism. I spoke Spanish. I've never worked with a fixer in Latin America or Central America. I've never hired one. I always do all my own fixing. I do all my own translation. I like go knock on government doors myself. And that's just 'cause that's how I started there, and that's how I'm comfortable there, I also had the lucky, Ida was talking about the experience of working with local journalists. Like, I was lucky enough I learned journalism. I was lucky enough to start in a context in a country that had a very strong photojournalistic tradition, which was Guatemala. Very competitive, bunch of newspapers, a lot of really good newspaper photographers. And I had no idea what I was doing, right? I was coming from the outside. And I learned from those photographers. I learned from those journalists, from the Guatemalan newspaper photographers. Many of whom I'm still friends with. Like, I was there in 2023. We all were covering I think it was my 5th presidential election in Guatemala that I covered. We're all running around together just like we've been doing for 20 years. It was awesome. So the relationship really depends on context. I mean, Afghanistan is a place where I've worked with the most number of fixers and local reporters. And I think there really is a distinction there. There are folks, mainly guys for me. I've mainly worked with male local reporters. And there are folks who kind of see themselves as, like, this is my kind of day job, this is my side hustle, Like, I know some people, I have tribal connections, I have family connections. My former job in a ministry allows me access to people that you are not going to answer your phone call. And, that's their way to make money. That's their profession. They're not necessarily interested in being reporters. They're not necessarily interested in sharing byline. That said, on the other hand side of it, I've worked with lots of folks who didn't want to become journalists, or who already worked in Afghan local media and who were extraordinarily valuable partners in that. And so, a lot of my, I did this over years, and it was like Asmat said, you'd kind of, who was available to work with, who could you develop a relationship with. I always try to be really, I'm a freelancer, right? I'm always kind of on the outside. I'm always having to like beg, borrow, steal from my editors in order to get money to be able to complete reporting, right? And so a thing I kind of developed with local reporters was I'd be like, okay, look, also we have to acknowledge that foreign journalism produced, for a Western audience is an extraordinarily disruptive kind of economic wave that hits a country when it's suddenly in the news, right? It upends everything, right? I mean, it's true. Like, there are big broadcast stations that'll pay $900 a day. That's a monthly salary in many of these places, and it causes a massive economic upheaval. I try to kind of navigate through that, surf that, right? Like, suddenly, like a person's insight, a person's language abilities, a person's connections are economically viable in a way that they weren't before, and they have to take advantage of that, and we have to be straight up about that, And if a massive international broadcast station is going to pay that, I have to figure out, okay, so how can I operate in this environment when that is the going rate, So what I'll try to do is, okay, listen, I got 5 assignment days next week. I'm going to chisel this much a day. I'm going to get $300 a day out of this on assignment rate. I'm also working on this kind of personal thing I want to do that I don't know if I'm going to be able to sell. I'm just investing money in this on my own. Could we do, if I'm going to get that rate for you from this big international client, could we come up with can we negotiate a rate there? And it is a negotiation, it is a back and forth, and we have to be kind of upfront about that. But in Afghanistan, my experience after the fall was kind of the most intense one, I stayed in Afghanistan during the fall
You were one of the very few Western journalists who were still there, right?
Yeah, very
The
few.
only one, maybe. Yeah.
No, I wasn't the only one. There was a crew of us, about 6 or 7 of us. But every major, I think except AFP, every major international outlet evacuated the country and pulled all of their personnel out. And then a few days later, of course, most of them wanted to start trying to reconstitute their operations. And it was kind of incumbent upon a group of us, Western journalists, to kind of reconstitute the operations for some of these international outlets. And so we had to kind of hire up, right? Everybody who'd worked with foreign journalists for the last 20 years was on a C-17 flying to Qatar. So we had to find people to work with and, as Azmat said, kind of train them to be journalists. And those partners of mine that we met in those very intense days that we brought on and kind of coached through what we needed to do, drivers as well, like both reporters and drivers, that was a completely different relationship, and one that I really had to rely on them in ways that I hadn't kind of before, because it was a completely new environment. And those are folks that were reporting partners, were local reporters in a completely different way.
So as a freelancer, do you have any ability to protect the local journalists you work with? Because very often they, as happened in Afghanistan, of course, they get targeted. And I know a lot of big news organizations do commit to trying to get them out of the country or otherwise protect them. But as a freelancer, if they've worked with you, are they sometimes vulnerable, and have you experienced that?
Well, I've been extraordinarily lucky in that regard, and most of the work I've done in Afghanistan in the last few years has luckily been for pretty big international outlets, and this hasn't been, especially like working with folks after the fall. It's kind of a lot easier now. I've been lucky in that regard. I haven't had that anyone that I've worked with from threatened that I had to worry about getting them out. Now, of course, I just have to be honest about this situation. I don't have the resources as a freelancer to support a family if someone was injured or killed or unable to work, or I don't have anybody I can call to evacuate someone from Afghanistan, period. I have to be realistic about that. Now, that said, what that informs is my approach up front, right? Like, I have to be extraordinarily careful about what my reporting goals are, about what I think is worth it and the risk both to myself and to someone else, I can take that risk on, but I can't, I have to be clear about what I'm asking of someone else, and also clear about what the consequences could be. And there's been times when I've decided against doing certain things because of that. But at the same time, this kind of work, especially if you're going to try to go where things are kinetic, it takes a level of daring, and you have to find people who, you are as clear as you possibly can be with. This is outside of the basic stuff, right? Like, I always have an extra set of PPE. Like, I'm not going to go somewhere where I'm wearing plates and a helmet and the person I'm with is not wearing a plates and helmet. That's baseline stuff. I'm talking, like, you're referencing, like, bigger picture stuff. And we have to be honest about what that requires.
Let me stick with you to get to sources, because and we've talked about this when you visited my class, there's often safety issues for somebody who's photographed. There are privacy issues. It may identify them to authorities in a way that's problematic. How do you approach that? Do you ever blur faces? How do you go about it in terms of consent, in terms of, do you ever override the individual's view of their safety and decide it's not safe? Just talk a bit about that whole issue, and then I'll get to both of you on that too.
It's actually pretty closely related to how I would deal with it with local partners, local reporters. It's not too awful different. Just up front, like, don't and won't blur faces. Like, that's outside of the realm of my photojournalistic ethics. That's far outside my realm. I wish we could have a really nuanced conversation about that with broadcast, because I find it unbelievably frustrating to watch broadcast news that blurs faces on any subject.
Explain why you have a problem with it.
Well, because my whole job is to put a face and a name to these big issues that are driving, that our societies and communities face. And by blurring the faces, we're really doing that not to serve our audience. We're doing that to protect ourselves as journalists, right? We can say that we're doing that to protect local people, but my view is that if it's that important to blur a face, I won't use the photograph. I mean, I did a huge project right before the fall, tried to do a big project where I photographed, over the course of a day, 30-something people who were applying for special immigration visas to leave Afghanistan and come to the United States. And a great big magazine was like, oh, we would love to do this, but we're afraid that if we publish these photographs, it looks like this is not going to go well, and these people are going to be vulnerable, and then we'll be on the hook to try to protect them. And I said, well, look, the best thing you could do to protect these people right now is to publish their faces in the pages of blank. And they said, well, no, I'll tell you what we'll do is we love the portraits, but if we can just blank out the faces, we'll publish them. And I was like, no, you can't have the pictures. Like, no, we're not going to do this project. The whole reason you're having this conversation with me is because you're affected by these people's faces and by what they're going to face, by the circumstances they're about to face, by looking into their faces and understanding them on a personal level. So why would I blur the faces out? I'm not going to do it. Now, that said, there are ways that I'll photograph people that cloud their identity without erasing it, right? And we can use visual tricks in that regard. We can use gauzy curtains. We can use silhouettes. That's often a thing I'll do. But again, my credibility is the currency I trade in. That's it. That's the only thing I have is my credibility. And if I'm blurring faces, if I'm obscuring the facts that I'm trying to reveal, I am compromising my own credibility. And I feel like, in a broader sense, news organizations are compromising their credibility when they do that. That's my view on it.
And by the way, we're going to open this to questions in probably about 15 minutes, so store them up. If you have something that's a great question you have to ask right now, raise your hand, but otherwise just wait to the end, and that'll be great. So just while I'm with you, Victor, somebody looks like this is the classic shooter help question, but a lot of people have not had the opportunity to explore it. When you're in places where terrible things happen, you're witnessing it, you're shooting it, where or when do you have responsibility to put down the camera and help out?
Yeah, it's actually, in my experience, it's always been very easy. It's never been complicated in the field. And the kind of rule that I kind of go by is, if I'm the most capable person in a situation, then I'm going to stop and I'm going to help, right? It's pretty rare that I'm the most capable person in a situation. Usually, and that's not because I'm not trained. I am trained in HEFAT, all that kind of stuff. Really, the valuable training I have is the former organization RISC in frontline combat first aid, which is kind of similar to a wilderness first responder. That's what it's based on. And I feel confident to use those skills, and I've used them in the field. So if there's no one else around and I'm the one with a first aid kit, which I've always got a first aid kit, I'm the one with tourniquets, and there's no one else around to apply it, then immediately I stop what I'm doing and do it. And I've done that before. Generally speaking, I'm usually embedded with fighting people. I'm usually following around a fighting unit. They have some degree of medical kind of care or medevac. And so that's not usually an issue. With civilians, obviously, that's when it can be different, and that's when I've deployed that. So, but it's never been that complicated for me. I've never been in a situation where I was like, oh, I'm going to miss a picture. If I'm the most capable person there, it's a quick read of the situation to ensure everybody's safety and react.
That question obviously applies to people who aren't just shooting Ido or Azmat, situations where you've had to sort of put down your role as a reporter and help somebody out, or where you think that's appropriate in any way?
I'm trying to think of an example where something that severe happened,
Yeah.
and I can't recall anything of that severity, but I do know of cases in which there were security questions, and what I, did was, I would tell my editor about it.
Yeah,
I would
yeah,
disclose to them, hey, this thing happened. In that situation, here's what I did. Is this something we would write about? That kind of thing. I do think that, where it's trickier. So I'm an investigative reporter which means you have to, like everything you do is dissected and you have to get through a fact check and you have to just be so detailed. It's like a very high bar to meet. And so I try, I try to protect all of that work as much as I can. And that means that, you don't want the appearance of a conflict of interest. You don't want, I don't want to look like an advocate or anything like that. That's not my role. And so I do my journalism. And sometimes there are ways in which the way I do that journalism, may help somebody. But that's not that is not why I'm doing that particular thing. So like, I can think of examples in which, there's a key subject of reporting that I did for the investigation I mentioned earlier, the 2017 one called The Uncounted. His name is Bassem Razo, and he woke up one night in September of 2015 to the night sky above him, and found out that he had been hit in an airstrike, and that his wife, daughter, brother, and nephew had all been killed. And he learned in the hospital that the US-led coalition had uploaded a video of this to YouTube and called his and his brother's homes a car bombing factory. And he set out on a quest to understand why this happened. And, I met Bassem in May of 2016, April or May of 2016, and, started reporting on his case and going to the DOD to ask about it. And I know at certain points they thought I was his advocate, and I would be very clear, like, I'm a journalist, I'm like investigating this case. And there was that misperception on their part, and I did worry, like, would that be used against me by them later? And at the same time, like, as I was uncovering information, I was sharing it with Bassem for his comment. And, what do you think? Like, here's the record I got related to I got the credibility assessment into the airstrike that killed your family members. I'll take you through it, and I'd like your response to it. And so, of course, he's benefiting from that, but I wasn't being his advocate. And so there are many examples like that. And I think that at the end of the day, my job is to be an investigative journalist. So I protect the reporting as much as I can, and I can be transparent about the process, but I'm not, if I were, and by the way, there are very legitimate paths in advocacy journalism that exist. This is by no means a criticism of people who choose that path. In fact, I think they play a really important role in journalism's ecosystem. So I wouldn't utilize my sort of carefulness around this subject to say that that's not appropriate or there aren't people who can do that. There are. I just think when you work for 5 years on a single investigation, you don't want to do anything that would open it up to, unfair charges.
Yeah, and just going back to Bassem, who has signed up for today's session on the stream, so may be watching, so welcome if you are. So just talking about relationships with subjects and sources, he obviously went through extraordinary life trauma. How did that play into how you worked with him to any techniques to kind of respect the traumatic experiences, to recognize them? And I'm going to ask Ida about that too. Yeah.
Oh, Bassem is amazing. Early on, the very first time we met, I think we did like a 2-hour interview. And I remember asking him about his wife. And I saw his lower lip tremble. And I kind of like moved on from the question. His wife who'd been killed, Mayada, whom he loves dearly. And I kind of had that saved as like, I need to come back to that. I want to know more about who she was as a person. And, I would meet him again and again. And I remember there was one trip in which I was supposed to get from Bassem the night of the airstrike, like a detailed rendering of what happened that evening. And I remember, I don't know, maybe it's like a month-long trip, I don't remember, but we would have like lunch frequently. And, the goal was to sit down and get that. And, we'd have lunch and he'd be like, oh, Asma, like, I'm feeling so good today. I'm in such a good mood. Can we not do it today? And he did that like day after day. And I was not going to force that conversation on him. And so it actually took like a very long time to get there. I feel like it wasn't until a few months later And he did get that, and part of that is I had time because nobody was accepting that pitch. Like literally nobody was interested in that story at the time. And I also just like didn't have it in me. And I understand there's people who do, who can kind of push somebody in that way. Obviously for a main character, you need that. For like a part of a sample, I wouldn't need those kinds of details, but for like a narrative. And so eventually, like I did get it. And I remember later on, we were doing podcast episodes for The Daily, and The Daily asked to re-interview him about the night of. And I was like, look, it took so much work to get him there. And, I want you to use the audio we recorded. And they're like, that audio quality is terrible. And we went back and forth about it. And I was like, fine, I'll ask him, but like, my preference is X. And I asked him and he agreed to do it. And what he told me at the time was like, actually, I've gotten more comfortable talking about it from like our experience in this reporting. And that was what I believed for years. And then last year, I had him talk to my students. And he's like, Asma, I've never told you something, but actually, like, I just wanted to do it for you. Like, I knew you needed it and wanted it. And he's like, and I told you that to make you feel better. And I remember being like, what? And he just, like, it was the sweetest thing. Like, I think half my students were crying, and I was obviously, like, crying too. And I don't know what to say. Like, people make their own decisions. I have immense respect and obviously, like, care deeply for this subject. And maybe it's my position to be deferential to that. At the end of the day, like, I don't need someone to do something in order to like let reporting shine. And I always sort of like preempt my interviews with anyone with like a number of things that kind of take into account who they are and how they look at things. So remember, like, people are not well versed or media savvy. They don't know that there can be things that are off the record or on background. In many of these places, there's such a culture of guest rights that everyone will invite you in. Like, no one will say no, and they don't know that they don't have to do that. Yeah. And so I would start off with like all my interviews with a lot of, and you can hear it. I think we did a daily episode in 2022, like January 18th, I think, or 20th, something like that, of 2022, in which like you can actually hear the process I go through with the start of these interviews. There's always a line too, like, it's really funny, you're gonna laugh. It's like, if I offend you, I'm so sorry, please know I'm not doing it on purpose, I'm just not from here. There's like a lot of that, a lot of like, you don't have to answer any of my questions. The children shouldn't, listen, they probably shouldn't be in the room while we're talking about this kind of stuff. Should we ask them to leave? All of that, those sort of, where their faces or voices or words will appear and how they'll be used and what ramifications might be. At the end of the day, it's their choice. But I do think we exercise a certain degree of autonomy in making those choices.
Ida, I'm going to take over from here. Just talk a bit about working with vulnerable sources. You've been both living and working in places where there have been a lot of very, very tough experiences, Morocco included. How do you interact with vulnerable sources? How do you see your relationship and just...
Sure. So I report mostly on migration, and so a lot of my sources often are undocumented or asylum seekers, so they're in very vulnerable situations, and I'm in a situation where I want to tell their story, but I also don't want to get them in trouble, and it's a really complicated relationship in that sense, because very often they're really willing to have their photo taken, to give the interview, but then you want to, as Asmat said, you want to have these conversations before and make sure they understand, and what we call informed consent. Just know, especially if they're going to be in the New York Times, I really have to explain to them, like, it's going to be, your picture is going to be in a paper that a lot of people read, that's going to be translated into Arabic, people are going to read it in Morocco. So let's talk about this. I have in mind the story I've done once about these 10 Moroccan women who worked on a farm in Spain. They're strawberry pickers. So Morocco every year sends thousands of women to work on these farms. And academics had been writing about this for years, about how there's a lot of systemic abuses happening on these farms, including labor law violations, but also sexual assaults. So these 10 women ran away from the farm. They were in a safe house in Spain. And I went to do a story on them, and we had 2 conversations with them. Is what is identifiable about you, because they didn't want people in their village to know they were sexually assaulted, and how much are you comfortable sharing? What do we do? And this is where conversations with editors are really, really important, and sometimes even bending the guidelines of the paper. So in this situation, we only use their initials. And the photographer took pictures of them where they've covered their faces. So we still had these very, very powerful photos, but you couldn't tell at all who they were. That happens also with minors who are crossing. I mean, I'm constantly confronted with this situation where I want to tell their story, and sometimes it's amazing. Like, I'm like, oh my God, I love this quote. This is amazing. What do I do? But I want to make sure I'm not going to get them in trouble, that they're not going to come arrest them. So it's always, always, always difficult. But I think editors are really helpful in situations like that, to just kind of have that back and forth, discuss with them. Actually, folks who do risk assessments in organizations are amazing to talk to in these situations. They kind of brainstorm with you the pros and cons, but also people have agency. So I really respect people's agency. So if someone tells me, I really don't care, so and we talk about it, and I make sure 4, 5, 6 times that they really think it's okay to use their interview, then it's fine.
I'm going to go to the audience in a minute. I just wanted to ask one more question from your own, both safety and ethics. Do any of you ever not identify yourself as a journalist when you're working in a difficult place?
So I'll
do
be
you always
honest.
identify yourself as a
I
journalist?
did it once.
You did, okay.
It was in a Moroccan police station, and it kind of it was very hectic. And I was going into the police station with this NGO worker they knew, and then no one asked who I was. And then I was seeing like a lot of things I needed to be seeing, so then I just like didn't say anything. So I didn't lie, but I didn't say who I was. That was the only time.
Yeah, my thing is, again, like you said, like the not lying about it. Like if somebody asks me, I'm always straight up about it. But I've just got just as much a right to walk around with the camera as anybody else. I got just as much right to point it at you as anybody else does. So I don't feel like I have to walk around with a big and this is kind of a weird thing for me too. I feel like in the kind of current environment we're in, there's a little bit of like I don't know what the word is for it really, like kind of projection or kind of like here. I don't walk around with a great big press, like a plate vest on with a press thing on it and a helmet, and all that kind of crap, because I feel like there's a lot of, I don't know, I guess the term people would use is like cosplaying about being a journalist and stuff. And I'm a citizen, a civilian like anybody else, and I have the same rights and responsibilities as any other civilian. Now, if somebody asks what I'm doing, asks what I'm up to, then obviously I'm going to identify myself as a journalist for sure.
And it's not just you, like, that it's, putting yourself at risk in some places, identifying yourself as a journalist. I talk about this with my journalism students a lot, like on certain campus protests or particular places where journalists are targets. There may be times in which you definitely don't want to broadcast that or make yourself very identifiable when you're doing particular things. There's, risk to you, but there's also risk to other people. And, there have been many places where I've been with sources, and it's best for me to just lay low and be quiet and not shout to people that I'm a journalist while I'm with somebody who, like, my presence with them could put them at risk. So that, has come up. I've never, that I can think of, I can never think of a time in which I lied or concealed it. But I do think that security is a major consideration with that. And sometimes there have been times where, like, minders have showed up to, like, accompany me around, and that puts sources at risk. And I'm always clear that I'm a journalist, but sometimes I might have to modify the questions I'm asking in front of other people so as not to put these sources at risk. So, like, I've done very boring interviews with minders around, about dental care under ISIS. So it just, it depends. And that's probably a bit of a stretch. There's no way I'm writing about that, but
Of course.
you do what you have to in those situations.
Let's open it up to the audience. It's been a fascinating conversation, but often the best part is when you ask questions, so please go ahead. And microphone's coming around.
Thank you so much. I'm Catherine, and I'm a graduate student here at NYU. And I'm curious about how you deal with the situation as a freelance journalist or when you're on staff, when you're reporting a story abroad and the editor or publication has a prescriptive idea about what that story should be that doesn't align with your reporting. I think as someone who's early in my career, I can feel a lot of pressure to just want to publish something, anything, but also I want it to be true, obviously, and I don't want to be, narratively sort of shaping it into maybe something that's less true. So I would just love to hear your advice on a situation like that.
I mean, a couple things off the bat is I would say that if you are working with editors as a freelancer who are trying to convince you to shape your stories in a way that is anything not only less than true but reflective and rigorous, then those are probably editors you don't want to be working with, even if they're at some big place, right? Like my career is littered with people who are like roadblocks in it, and I just have to figure out a way to kind of try to get around them. That was my first impression. My second impression is, sometimes you can't compromise on rigor, you can't compromise ethically, and you can't compromise on the truth. But sometimes editors kind of have some interesting perspectives that might clash with what you initially thought you were going out to do. And this is a collaboration. Like my best work comes when I collaborate. My best work comes when I collaborate with writers, like hands down, when I collaborate with good editors. So I try to have a little bit of humility about it. And for sure you're going to run into a situation where obviously Ida and Asma are representative of this as well. Like I make a big point to try to be an area expert on the places I cover, right? Like as much as I possibly can. Like I read very deeply. I follow the news granularly on the places that I'm covering. Like, of course, I get assigned sometimes to parachute in, but that's not my optimal. I'm not that good at that, to be honest. I'm not very talented at that. I'm much better when I can kind of stumble around and figure out the truth for myself. So that collaboration between editors and myself is key, and find people who value your expertise. Try to work with those folks and try to bob and weave around the people who don't. That's my advice.
Absolutely. I'll add to that there are two things that can happen. Is if they see something, let's say on the BBC, and they're like, "Oh, can you confirm that?" So, and it's not actually something you can confirm or things like that. But usually, if your reporting is very good and you have good sources, you can convince an editor. I'm more in my own experience, and I completely agree with what you just said. You actually can have really, really interesting conversations and back and forths. And usually, when you know your story, it's fine. Editors just want to learn more and trust your reporting. Where it gets more tricky is in the situation where you have a local journalist with a foreign journalist, where it's the foreign journalist who has the lead byline, taking the story in a direction where the local journalist, who in many, many cases, if not all cases, knows the story better, and is like, no, that's not the story, but the foreign journalist really wants it to be that story. That's when the relationship is very difficult, because very often the local journalist has no power and sometimes doesn't even have access to editors, and then they don't know what to do, and they just have this person who doesn't have linguistic or cultural fluency in the story driving the framing, and that's when it's a lot harder to kind of break that.
Catherine, without naming names, if you have a specific example, I forgot where you were reporting most recently, of where somebody wanted the story to go, it might help us frame it better.
Oh, no, that was perfect.
Okay. Oh, okay. Okay.
And I'll say real quick too, the thing Ida was saying is, when we read those stories, we know those stories. Like when I read a story in the paper and it's the story that she's describing, I know that story off the bat, and then I make a mental note. Oh, that writer, that reporter. Okay, that's how they operate. That's cool. And next time their byline comes up, I'm like, maybe I'll skip that one.
I might add too. I wish earlier on that I had understood that you can walk away from something, or that you don't have to do something, or you can do something badly that you don't want to do. right? Like I think I remember once years ago, I'm not going to get into the details, this is more than a decade ago, I was asked to kind of interview someone from a somebody who had gone through war and had suffered serious abuses. And like I was tasked with this interview, but apparently in a more senior editorial meeting, it was decided, well, because I would be doing this interview with this girl who was subject to a bombing campaign, I now had to do an interview the next day that would air the next night with a child from the country where the bombing was happening, and tell her story, or like a story of some child, so that we could equally balance these two things. And like I remember being like, oh gosh, like where do I find like a compelling child to tell a story from this particular thing that I'm being asked to do? And like it did not occur to me at the time that I could say no and say I couldn't find somebody, that I could just do a bad job of it, right? And it created this false equivalence I was really uncomfortable with. And I throughout my career, like the things that have been the hardest were things that I didn't, eventually I walked away from, but it took me so long to realize it was at that point, and I wish I'd done it earlier. I think the hardest story, the worst story I've never worked on, it's never seen the light of day because in the end it was a walk away situation, but like I remember writing like a 6-page memo on why we should kill it. It made no sense to me. I never understood it. Like I remember like telling an editor, like, I don't know why you're making me do this. Like it had fallen out of some other reporting. It was like a side character. It was an investigation. It was like made to write this like bonkers profile that made no sense. And I couldn't kill it. And like the amount of time we went over it over and over, and I kept doing new drafts of it and like not understanding it. And I wish I just walked away early on. I wish I'd known that. I wish I'd known I could do that. But when you're younger in particular, you're just trying to do a good job and reconcile your reporting with this editor you might like, but sometimes just buy is the best thing. And if not buy, then sometimes there's editors that you can manage these situations with, which you can kind of like, well, okay, you want me to look at X. I've reported out X. It's not landing. Here's what I have. Your 6-page memo. And if that doesn't work, then bye.
Let's take another question. Thank you, Catherine.
I'm wondering, as a photographer, what kind of equipment you bring with you. I'm sure you like to travel as light as you can because you're on the go constantly, but you need your professional gear. Could you tell us a bit about that? And I also wanted to ask you about video. It seems like you do stills exclusively, is that right? Or do you also shoot video? And if you don't, do you sometimes yearn to capture more than the still image?
I have a set of working digital cameras. There's like a bunch of companies that make them. They all cost too much money for what they do. They're very frustrating. I carry some analog cameras as well sometimes because of format. I like some analog formats that you can't replicate as easily in digital. I try to travel pretty light, but you can only travel kind of so light and have the stuff you need to do the job you need to do. I am a still photographer, primarily still photographer. I'm also a filmmaker sometimes. I try not to do the two things kind of side by side because it really affects how well you can do them. I mean, I know that it's a little bit of a pedagogical priority to kind of teach this kind of one-man band. And I do think that helps especially when you're breaking into the journalism industry, to be able to do multiple things. But I can tell you there's nobody working at the level of these women who are doing 5 things at once. That's just not a thing. Like if you want to be at this level, you're not going to be able to be also getting great audio and shooting video and shooting your own photos. That's not a thing. So I try to not do all of them at once. But and then filmmaking is like a whole. That's so much more complicated. It's so much more gear. It's so much more time, and it's quite involved. But yeah, I mean. I don't use like an iPhone, and I never I make it a point to always have my cameras out when I'm working, like I don't try to conceal them. I don't try to I wouldn't be good. I have like some kind of weird, like something on my back that's like, hey, look at this guy, or watch out for this guy. Like I'm not a sneaky guy, and so it doesn't help to hide my cameras in my big scarves or anything like that. Like I just have them kind of out, holding them so people know that I'm taking pictures. People know kind of what I'm doing.
How many cameras did you bring to your recent reporting trip in Syria? And roughly, and did you have analog and digital, or what was your your overall equipment? Because I imagine it's heavy and it's also subject to theft, right?
Oh yeah, I mean that sucks. Yeah, it's heavy and it's a pain, and I mean I kind of I don't really like cameras that much, you know, like which is complicated. I bring 2 digital cameras. I usually only work with one, but I have to have a backup one because, again, they're too expensive and they fail. And then it depends on the approach that I'm taking, right? Like and then you plan for that, like analog wise. So I brought an analog camera as well. You know, in Syria a couple years ago, I did a big project where I photographed the ruins of the twin ISIS capitals in this kind of large format, panoramic format with this big ass camera, and it was complicated and frustrating and was totally annoying. But I had to do that because I try to match the format with the themes that I'm trying to communicate.
We had a question here. That, if you can bring the camera, the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Carolina. I'm a student at the Columbia Journalism School, and both Asma and Ida have been my professors. So, my question is about how to navigate when you're trying to enter a situation, a place you're reporting on, and you maybe don't know all of the political nuances that are being dealt with, and you don't want necessarily the local journalists to be inferring their political views on your reporting. In that case, do you have more than one local journalist? Because at the same time you remain an outsider. So, yeah, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, and that comes up a lot. And like at the same time, you want to both be aware of perspectives of people you could work with and situations in which those perspectives might be an asset. Sometimes certain sources would be more comfortable with somebody that they do know shares a particular perspective, and sometimes that can be helpful. You may also want to take like a recording of those interviews and like run the translation by someone else later. I think something that comes up a lot in studies with local journalists about the relationship between foreign journalists working with them is that they often feel like their very legitimate concerns about reporting are downplayed as, oh, you're not objective, you're from here. And so there's also like a very, toxic belittling of locals and their informed insights that can happen too. So I don't want to, talk over those things, but I think that sometimes knowing who people have worked with previously, and that can be more than just journalists. Sometimes there's NGOs. I really do like working with translators, or in the past I really have. If you're with a news organization, there's like a very limited vetted set of people you can work with that have met whatever probably social media scrub that this news organization has gone through. But like if you're a freelancer, there's more, I think, freedom here. And what you'll find is that, like I have found that working with people who've worked with Human Rights Watch or with particular organizations tend to be automatically more trained in sensitive interviewing techniques, or some of the things that you might find more compatible in that political way might have more of a human rights lens that's brought them to that work. But yeah, it's a lot of research, asking who they've worked with, talking to some of those people, at the same time also like recognizing where you may be wrong or you may be imposing that outsider perspective.
I think once in a while too, sometimes you gotta balance it. I have done stories where I've worked with 2 people before, and I like meet with one guy in the morning and the afternoon to go do the interview, and then somebody else in the evening. Now that can bring up serious security problems. Like you got to be really careful about doing that kind of thing. But I have done that before. It's kind of to have a balanced kind of view. And then of course, after the fall, we had to kind of hire up folks who all of a sudden had a completely different profile than every single Afghan journalist of the last 20 years, because there were folks who were comfortable with the Taliban, folks who were comfortable, who had connections, people who were from their villages. We hired a bunch of Chak Wardakis who were not in the pantheon of Afghan journalists for the last 20 years, because those folks' perspective was seen as too close to, but all of a sudden they were of extreme value to us, And so I think having that, and it was like a massive tension. because you had all these exiled Afghans who were, on the exact opposite side of these folks who just won, still working for the paper, and there was like a real clash of perspectives there, and that we had to kind of oftentimes sort of umpire a little bit, like, yeah, I don't know if that story that guy is proposing is really going to work out so well. So you got to kind of balance that thing, and I think that for all of us being as informed and as open to the nuances, here's the thing, like every one of these stories, every one of these contexts, every one of these countries, every one of these conflicts is so complex, is so nuanced. It's got a million facets to it. And kind of to your question before, like my job is to try to bring as many of those facets into my reporting as I can, not flatten it and like wipe stuff out. I'm trying to bring stuff in a way that readers can kind of understand.
And I'll just add to that. Sometimes I've been in situations where I'm the one who speaks, let's say, the language of the driver, and then I'm with someone who really wants to do something we're all telling them they shouldn't be doing, and then they still want to do it anyway, and then the driver is, of course, yelling at me because I'm the only person who understands what they're saying. And in these situations, I think if I were in a situation where I really want to get a story, and someone's telling me, actually, this is not good, I would never, at least don't pressure the person to do it anyway. Because ultimately, you're paying someone who needs to be paid for that day of work or a week of work or whatever. But if they don't want to do it, and you think it's fine to do it, maybe reassess, find someone else. But I think one of the things to keep in mind is to not force people to do something they don't feel safe doing.
I think we really have time for one more question, so does somebody have one?
Hi. Are you always able to protect your information? I mean, were you ever in the situation where police wanted to search your phone or your computer? How do you protect your data and your sources?
I mean, I think it's become a lot more complex in recent years, given the level of digital surveillance, the number of companies that exist that governments can use to monitor and surveil journalists. So even beyond just having your phone taken, like the ways in which people can penetrate our technologies today is more dangerous than ever. So my number one piece of advice would be to function, or try your best to function as though what is on your phone is something that somebody has access to. And the things that are truly that sensitive, encrypt them, put them in places that are separated if you can. I remember coming back from like Egypt after the 2011 revolution, the Arab Spring at the time, and like Customs and Border Patrol asked to see my notes, and I was like, no. Like, can we look at any footage? And I was like, no. And I don't know what that's like now. I did return, I think like the last foreign trip I came back from, it was like Inauguration Day, and I remember being like, I wonder if it'll be different. I don't know in the time since. I know journalists who have been questioned and asked about these things. I have had to like run my phone most recently in a country I'm not going to name. I think like at some point I was stopped at a checkpoint, and my and a colleague's things were put through this like security system. We were separated off, and I don't know what happened to that particular, it was out of my hands for a little bit, and put through like a scanner and things like that. And I remember like being like, I have to change my phone now, I have to change my laptop now. And I just really think the less you can put on these things, like there are people working on this to do incredible digital security surveillance and monitoring. Has your phone been hacked? But like at the end of the day, like we live in a world where there are these tech companies that function and work in secrecy, that sell weapons of surveillance to states around the world who crack down on people like us with impunity. There are no consequences for them. And so like at the end of the day, I would just think through that.
I mean, there's not that much you can really do about it, And even if you can encrypt it all day, you can have as much protected information as you want. But you're sitting somewhere and someone's like, open your phone, and what are you going to say? I'm not going to open my phone. Well, the gun cocks or whatever. Open your phone now. So I think Asmat's right. Like trying to keep as much anything you have on you, you got to assume that somebody's going to have access to and they can see. That's the best kind of way to think about it, I think.
Do people use Signal or WhatsApp, or what do you use to communicate back home?
I mean, yeah, I use Signal and WhatsApp, depends on for who I'm talking. I use Signal all the time, but there's no guarantee that
Yeah,
those things aren't
sure.
complicated, and there's no guarantee, like Asmat said, there's tons of systems that can record your
But-
keystrokes,
Yeah.
get in there and see.
But still worth doing as opposed
Oh,
to just
absolutely.
going over more open channels, right?
There are little things too,
Yeah.
sorry if I may, real quick. Just like you can have a separate phone that is like populated with other things that you might pull out first, and like maybe you let that get taken. But none of this is a guarantee. All of these are like workarounds that you can try. And so, like, I know in Pakistan for years there was so much crime where people, like, a lot of women had fake purses, fake phones that they would like give up when they were, held up. And so sometimes there are things like that that I know journalists carry. I don't want to get too specific, so I can like chat more afterward if it would be helpful. But other phones are useful when you can. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in Morocco specifically, I've sat through trials of journalists where they were just reading their phones, and with all the spywares they've used, they just have everything. And I think, I mean, we know that it's easy for them to record in real time activity on the phone. So just always assume that's how I operate. I just assume my phone is being watched. And yeah, I don't have much more to add to all the great things you both said.
Yeah, maybe we can sneak in one other quick question because somebody over here had a question, and then that's it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. This is such a great panel. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your process for preparing for an overseas reporting trip. I find that whenever I'm going somewhere abroad for a limited time, I feel like there's so much that I want to do and make sure that I accomplish and gather. But then there also has to be a certain room for spontaneity or like meeting someone that you wouldn't have expected to meet. So if you could all just talk a little bit about your processes.
I'm actually teaching a class about that this spring. So I can maybe share some of the things we do in the class. So usually what I do if I'm going somewhere new is, well, read books about the place, have a lot of meetings with people who are from there. I try to kind of immerse myself, so I'm going to be following people from there on social media, especially local journalists. They're invaluable to get constant information about a place, listening to podcasts from a place, trying to understand what the culture is, the humor, what people are thinking about, and also preparing as much as I can beforehand a list of sources, people to meet, locations, depending on what the place is like, if it's a relatively safe place or not. Also find out, do I need press accreditation? Am I going to get away with maybe going in without press credentials? Or an authorization to report. So like in Morocco, for example, which is relatively fine for foreign reporters, very often they come in, they start filming, they don't realize they need a film permit in Morocco, they get deported within the day. So these are the kind of things you just have to think ahead, like small logistical things. And then in terms of safety, do a risk assessment. CPJ has great guidelines for that, but also sometimes just call people who are there, sometimes just a hotel. Just speak to the receptionist. How are things? Are things calm? What should I do? And yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I never thought about calling the hotel. That's really smart. That's awesome. My general thing is everything Ida said for sure. And then I just try to have a plan up front, and then I'm willing to jettison that plan immediately, right? Like, I don't like getting on the plane and not having a plan, not having an idea what I want to do. But I also got to, like, when I land somewhere, not be so wedded to the plan that I'm going to, like, not be open, like you said, to not just spontaneity, but, like, 99% of the time I show up and there's a much more interesting story to tell than the one I thought from home, right? And I've never been an expat journalist. I've always lived in my country, my kind of context, and then traveled, and then I've kind of had this conversation over the years with friends of mine who were expat journalists. And I'm always like, man, you guys are doing it so much smarter than me. This is so dumb. It's so hard for me to like prepare for this. And then they're like, no. The way you do it's so much better because, you show up and you're like focused and you're like bang, 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 get it out. We live here and I do, a couple stories a year so I think it's a trade-off. But I always try to have no plan survives contact with the enemy. That's the rule. And so you got to be ready to like toss it out the window as soon as it's not working for you.
All right, listen, I want to thank this extraordinary panel, Asmad, Ida, and Victor. A more experienced or thoughtful group of international journalists you're not going to run across, and it's so grateful for you coming here today, and thank you all for coming as well.